So, I've got a confession to make. I am not an artist. I don't have a single creative bone in my body when it comes to drawing or painting or anything like that. Art was always my least favorite class in school because I knew that I was going to struggle to come up with anything that looked remotely good, especially when compared to my classmates. I mean, sure, I would get the work done and it would get whatever grade the teacher decided to take pity on me and give me, but there's a very good reason why I never took another art class after middle school. And it's not that I dislike art. I mean, art museums are cool, and I always appreciate going into them to see what people that are actually talented can come up with. It's just not something that I have any kind of talent for, and to be completely honest, anyone that's watched this channel for any length of time, well, you know. Due to that, I'm not exactly going to be, picking up a paintbrush or a sketch pad anytime soon. It's just not my thing, even more so than clacks. And when it comes to art-related computer programs, they're definitely a means to an end for me. Like, I'm not exactly spending my time doodling when I'm working in MS Paint. So, when it comes to paint programs disguised as games, I usually end up doubly annoyed, in that they try to trick me into believing that there, might be some sort of game elements hiding in the software, and that I wasted an hour to create a skeleton using his death ray vision to light a campfire to roast a hot dog. Now you see why I hated art class, don't you? However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now confused because you don't know why someone would draw a skeleton trying to cook a hot dog. Well, hi, my name is Dave and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where, trust me, I wish I knew why I drew that. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Unfortunately for me, the case of the Sega-branded art program has come up before on the channel, twice in fact, with the first time being when I reviewed Art Alive in episode 92 and then Wacky Worlds in episode 192. Art Alive was just a flat-out terrible experience for me, and not just because I'm not a great artist, but because the title is notorious for its limitations. Key being that it doesn't support the Sega mouse, due to the Sega mouse not existing yet, and not supporting saving your work, with the only suggestion being to hook your Genesis up to a VCR, and then you record your work that way. Now, I don't think I have to explain why that's a terrible idea. Wacky Worlds, on the other hand, fixed both of those issues, releasing with the Sega mouse included in the package and having battery backup. But even still, it was a bit too little too late, especially in comparison to Mario Paint on the SNES, which had released over 2 years prior. Having reviewed both of those titles, I had thought that I was done with the artistic type releases in this catalog, and technically I was, at least on the Genesis. What I didn't realize was that the Sega CD was hiding one as well, with My Paint, the animated paint program, being released at some point in 1994. You always know it's going to be an interesting review when the internet only has a vague notion of what year something was released, much less an actual release date. So what is My Paint? And more importantly, is this obscure release worth your time? Well, I'll try to figure that out and not draw any more hot dog eating skeletons in the process, but first a look at the package. And here's my copy of My Paint, the animated paint program for the Sega CD. At first glance, this copy looks a bit rough, and it is, but honestly, most of the damage is to the front of the case, so it looks worse than it is. Opposite of last week's copy of Mortal Kombat, which had both hinges intact, My Paint has neither hinge intact, and a nice crack at the bottom to boot. Clearly this copy has seen better days, and I might eventually try to at least swap the case out for one that's in better condition, but I don't think I'll try to replace the entire game. The reason for that is because My Paint is actually a slightly valuable title, due to its relative obscurity and the fact that, at least for the Sega CD version of the game, this was a region exclusive to North America. My Paint didn't even have a Brazilian release, so if you want a copy of it, this is your only option. With that being the case, copies of My Paint currently start out averaging between $45 and $50, hence why I would rather just try to get a cheaper case than try to track down another copy that's in nicer condition. Looking past the condition of the case, let's take a look at that front cover artwork, and oh boy, there's some stuff going on here. We've got a space shuttle in the middle of a launch, a Black Panther in some grass, and what appears to be a Brontosaurus or Apatosaurus or something like that in mid-brushstroke or spray, depending on which hand you're looking at. Seems like a lot, but honestly, I like it, as it's trying to show all of the things that you could potentially do with the program, and add on to that, at the bottom of the cover, there's a bunch of paint cans of different colors, but if you look closely, it's not just paint cans, as the different colors also have textures mixed in. Also, and this is a small detail, but with this being an artistic release, I like how over to the side, the artwork overlays the Sega CD banner, showing that the designers weren't afraid to go outside the lines, so to speak. Flipping over the back, and if you look close, you'll notice that there's some wrinkling from some water damage back here, and I suppose that could be more motivation to replace this copy, but I don't think it's too bad, and there's no staining or ink bleed anywhere. Unfortunately, even if the rear cover was in perfect condition, it would still be boring, as it looks just like any other PC productivity title, with a bunch of black text on a white background, with really only a short bullet list of features and the 3 screenshots over to the right to break up the monotony. To their credit, the 3 screenshots are at least of different parts of the title and are all of good quality, but libraries with a Y? Come on now, who can't spell libraries correctly? Opening up the case carefully, and I'd like to point out that according to the introduction, this isn't a manual, it's a guidebook, apparently. Regardless of what you call it, it's actually a nice detailed set of instructions for My Paint with explanations for each of the 3 possible control schemes, depending on whether you're using a 3-button controller, 6-button controller, or the Sega mouse. Along with that, all of My Paint's different options are detailed with not just instructions, but also pictures detailing which buttons do what functions, and all of the different things that you can do in My Paint. Okay, that's the package. Let's load up My Paint and see if it reigns supreme when it comes to productivity titles on the Genesis or Sega CD. With every game that's reviewed on the channel, I try to delve into the history behind the title, because oftentimes a piece of software didn't actually originate with this particular release. For instance, again with Mortal Kombat from last week, it started out as an arcade title before appearing on the Genesis and then being ported to the Sega CD. My Paint is no different, and the Sega CD version of My Paint is not the first time the software was released onto the market. It didn't start out in the arcades, of course, but instead originated on home computers, specifically the Commodore Amiga, and not the Macintosh or MS-DOS systems. That Amiga release was followed up with a port for the Commodore CDTV, which there's a very good chance that if you're an American, you've never heard of. The short version is that the CDTV is a consoleized Amiga 500. Admittedly, that's the very short version, so if you're curious to know more about the CDTV, I would seek out other videos on the subject, as I certainly cannot do it justice. But in researching My Paint, I actually stumbled onto a port to a platform that's even more obscure than the CDTV, and something that I had never heard of until this week. You see, before My Paint would eventually make it to the Sega CD, it was released on the Viz platform, with Viz apparently standing for Video Information System. The reason why I had never heard of the Viz is because it was Tandy's attempt at creating a consoleized PC based around Windows 3.1, and with it being a Tandy product, it was only sold in Radio Shack. And saying it was sold is probably being generous, due to the Viz having a list price of $699 in 1992, which amounts to around $1,600 today. Now, just imagine if Microsoft tried to sell an Xbox for $1,600. They would burn Redmond to the ground. Actually, you know what? I guess you don't have to imagine, because as Yesterzine reminded me this last week, Panasonic would attempt that very same trick a year later in October of 1993, and clearly we can see how well that worked out for them, with everyone playing the latest Assassin's Creed on their brand new 3DO Series X. Also, I'm just now realizing that there's probably people watching this video that don't know what a Tandy is because they don't know what a Radio Shack is. Hell, they probably don't know what a 3DO is for that matter. Let's just move on to the actual review before I turn to a pile of dust. When booting up MyPaint, you're presented with a logo for developer Saddleback Graphics. Personally, I had never heard of Saddleback Graphics before doing the review this week. Seems like a theme here. Anyway, chances are you haven't either, because as far as I can tell, this Sega CD port of MyPaint is the only piece of software that they ever released. Now, that might not be accurate, and they may have created other PC-based design programs, but trying to find records 30 years later is a bit difficult, and the only other thing that I'm sure that they worked on was not software specifically, but video guides for using graphics programs from other developers, i.e. Deluxe Paint, which you might not know by name, but it's that piece of software that always seems to have an Egyptian pharaoh on the cover. The whole point is, Saddleback Graphics wasn't exactly tearing up the charts with hot software releases in the early 90s, and as best as I can tell, they weren't absorbed into any other company either, so immediately I've got concerns with the quality of the release. However, if you keep digging, what you'll find is, even though Saddleback apparently was the developer of the original version of the title, the Sega CD version was published by Saddleback, but actually developed by WayForward Technologies. Yes, that same WayForward that still exists, and is currently famous for the Shantae and River City Girls franchises. So at least you might have heard of them. But being that MyPaint and Mickey's Ultimate Challenge, which was released that same year, were their first efforts on consoles, I've still got concerns. Once you get past the Saddleback Graphics logo, you'll get an animated title screen for MyPaint that features an array of various cartoonish animals, with the implication being that you could use MyPaint to draw all of those same animals, or something similar. From there, you're a start button away from entering the actual program, which presents you with a blank canvas ready for you to doodle to your heart's content. At first, this screen confused me a bit because your color palettes appear to run off the bottom of the page, but this is actually a design choice, and one that I think is smart once you get used to it. With the Sega CD having a relatively low screen resolution, you'll need all the screen real estate that you can get if you want to draw a picture, so placing some of the buttons below the bottom of the screen makes sense, rather than trying to squish the canvas down to the size of like a postage stamp. At the top of the screen above the canvas are several drawing options. Most are pretty standard. There's tools for freehand drawing, spray paint, lines, rectangles, and circles. But one that stands out a bit is a repeating tool that divides the screen into 4 quadrants and then automatically draws whatever you're working on into each of the 4. I'm probably not doing a great job of explaining that, and it's a tool that I'm sure will only get used in very specific scenarios, but I thought it was cool for them to implement something that was a bit outside the norm. Of course, all the tools in the world don't matter unless you've got access to a decent color palette, which, as mentioned, is located in the bottom of the screen. By default, there's actually several color palettes, which can be selected via up and down arrows, each consisting of 16 different colors. You're probably thinking, oh, well, that's mildly annoying to have to swap palettes to get over 16 colors, but at least you can just hit a button to choose another color that's not currently shown. And, well, here's where you run into my first actual issue with the title. You see, even though the Sega CD supports 64 colors on screen at a time without any programming trickery, any art that you create is always limited to just the 16 colors specified in any specific palette. And when you choose a new palette, all the colors on the screen are replaced by their analogs in the new palette. I.e., if you had red in slot 4, and the next palette instead now has blue in that slot, when you change palettes, anything on the canvas that was red is now going to be blue. To their credit, in utilizing the options screen, you can create custom palettes. So if you're working on a drawing that needs a lot of red, you could swap out other colors for different reds, but you'll still be limited to whatever's in those 16 slots. It's not the end of the world, but it is disappointing. Think about it this way. When you were in school, did you want to be the kid that only had the 16-color Crayola box that was the minimum requirements on the supply sheet for that class, or did you want to be the kid that had the giant 64 crayon box that also had the sharpener in the back? Sure, you might not use all those crayons, and some might get lost or broken or eaten by the kid that's going to join the Marines one day, but at least you had options. To somewhat counteract the lack of colors available, there is also a second palette available that includes 16 different patterns. The colors used in the patterns are going to reflect what you have in the main palette, but at least they're there, and they make creating a drawing that has some texture to it a lot easier. The best way I can describe this effect is in referencing Stan from The Secret of Monkey Island. And if you don't get that reference, just stop watching this video and go play Monkey Island instead. You'll thank me, and I'll still be here when you get back. But what if you're like me, and if you had to draw everything by hand, the only thing anyone would be able to take away from the picture is that it appeared to be drawn by a kindergartner, rather than what it is actually supposed to be? In that case, my paint thankfully includes 10 coloring books, each with at least 16 pages that you can choose as the basis of your artwork, plus additional surprise pages that don't reveal what they are until you uncover them with a magic wand. Remember the seemingly random space shuttle, dinosaur, and panther from the cover art? Well, they're actually not so random, as 3 of the coloring books are space, dinosaurs, and Africa. The pages are nice because the lines that are drawn are printed just like an actual coloring book, and they aren't removed when you go to erase something where maybe you went outside the lines a bit. So you don't have to worry about starting all over. Each book also has some stickers that go along with it, and a max of 5 of those stickers can be placed on the page, again saving you from having to freehand everything. In a nice bit of programming, you can also mix and match the stickers from any of the coloring books, so if you want to have a bunch of dinosaurs watching a space shuttle launch, have at it. That covers most of the options that are available in the title, but I have to mention one thing that isn't included, and it's a pretty glaring omission. One of the icons on the main screen is for a VCR tape. You would think that this would be for saving your work, and that's what I assumed as well. I mean, my paint came out over 2 years after Art Alive, and the Sega CD has a built-in non-volatile storage. Surely they didn't repeat the same mistake of not being able to actually save your work. Oh, but they did, and the VCR icon is actually an indicator of being able to isolate your artwork in a frame and then be able to record that to tape to save your work. This is a huge miss, and I don't understand what they were thinking at all. I mean, could you imagine spending an hour drawing and coloring something, getting it exactly how you wanted with various custom palettes and texture choices, and then having it all just go away when you turn off the console? Or losing your work due to a power outage? To include all those other great options and then goof this up is a painful self-inflicted wound, to say the least. From a sound perspective, there's a little more here of note than you might be expecting for a virtual coloring book title, although nothing that will really blow you away. When working on a page from a coloring book, if the page includes something that makes noise, i.e. an animal, you can select the microphone icon to play a sound effect that goes with that item. I'm not sure how useful that actually is, but I could see young kids liking it, and there's lots of those somewhat hidden sound effects. Each book also has a specific background music track that goes with it, and if you get tired of that track, you can switch to a different book without changing what you're currently working on to get some new music. All of the music is nice and chill, and it goes well with drawing and creativity, so it's more atmospheric than anything that's actually going to reach out and grab you. However, it should be noted that each of the music tracks are only about 2 minutes apiece, so you'll probably get pretty tired of it quickly, and thankfully it can be turned off completely as well. On the back of the box, it did mention that my paint's music was partially composed by Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead, and while that's notable, mainly because I definitely did not have that on my bingo card for a Sega CD title, don't expect to be hearing anything resembling Casey Jones or Touch of Grey here. Honestly, I have to question how much he was actually involved, as there's only a few guitar parts here and there, and most of the music was done on a synthesizer. My Paint is a multimedia title, like a few on the Sega CD, that isn't actually a game, and I'm sure that that's a problem for some people, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad release on its own. For instance, and I usually make a habit to not look at other review scores for titles because I don't want anyone else's opinions to influence these reviews, but if you check Sega Retro for other review scores, UK magazine Megatech gave it a completely irresponsible 2, which wouldn't be so bad on my scale, but for them that was 2 out of 100. My only guess is that reviewer Rich Lloyd was upset that he got assigned My Paint to review instead of an actual game, so he decided to take the piss in response when it came to writing the review. Now, I clearly take things more seriously around here, but I think he had the right idea, and I'll be giving it a 2 as well, but just out of 5, of course. This is clearly not a title for everyone, and honestly, if you're looking to do creative type things, I think Wacky Worlds on the Genesis is definitely the better option, just from the aspect of being able to save your work, not to mention Mario Paint on that other platform. However, if you just want to sit down for a bit and chill while coloring, and you happen to have a Sega CD lying around, you could do a lot worse than My Paint. And that's it for My Paint, the animated paint program on Sega CD. My Paint is clearly not a perfect title, with even the loading times that affected Mortal Kombat last week rearing its ugly head at times, and the lack of a save function especially, but I'm glad it's part of the Sega CD library. It was nice to explore its history this week, as it's definitely a unique title in the catalog that I think most people have either forgotten about or never knew existed to begin with, especially considering that it was a North American exclusive. It's clearly not a title for everyone, and I could see most collectors skipping it, but personally, I'm glad that it was on my list, because I never would have known about Radio Shack's greatest console, the Viz, otherwise, and that would have been a shame. Next time on the channel, no, unfortunately, I am not going to be going 3 for 3 and reviewing another Sega CD title. I gotta mix things up a bit, especially with the Sega CD only having around 150 releases total, and I've already covered 5 just in the first half of this year. Instead, I think it will be back to the Genesis, and a game that I didn't have planned out, but then when I looked over the shelves, it just made sense based on current events. And no, this isn't related to the unfortunate deaths of Hulk Hogan or Ozzy Osbourne. No, this is something a lot more positive, and a game that might have you looking up to the sky, or reaching for the popcorn. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 292. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later!